We're back with the Sayfie Review Florida Leaders Summit. At the heart of the Sayfie Review Florida Leaders Summit was the goal of having the participants come up with a questionnaire asking presidential candidates how they would address Florida-specific issues. We covered two groups talking about the economy and health care. The first panel was concerned about the need to increase the number of people who are actually seeking work instead of sitting on the sidelines or giving up.
But do you think that entitlement reform would help increase the participation rate with folks that are looking to increase their skill set and possibly get back into the workforce?
I know the fights that we have when it comes to development and actually asking for local hires, which contractors aren't willing to do. And then so when we try to write in, like, we want community benefits agreements, and developers don't want that. And they rather bring in their own people rather than develop the skills of the people. And so then that would be, how do we hold those presidential candidates, but also our local governments accountable to the fact that they're not even allowing those opportunities to be there.
I think the question is, we observe that long-term the U.S. has a problem with the declining labor force participation rate. There are ways to address that, such as immigration policy, entitlement reform, maybe helping with child care so people would be inclined to have more kids. What would the president do about that?
Okay. That's really good.
After the discussion, the group agreed on this question to pose to presidential candidates.
But long-term, the U.S. has a problem with a declining workforce participation rate. Some areas to consider addressing this issue include immigration reform, especially seeking high-skilled, highly educated immigrants. Also considering entitlement reform or even policies to increase the birth rate. What would you do as president to address these important issues?
Another group of Sayfie Review Florida Leaders Summit invitees were discussing what presidential candidates could do to improve the health care system.
I think the overarching question to any presidential candidate is what changes would you make to the Affordable Care Act, and how many people would that then cover?
Depending on the policies or what we decide, the question is always to involve empathy as in the healthcare system, which is something that really lacks, I believe, in healthcare and brings a lot of emotion and fear in people. So I think that empathy would be something that I would add to the final question.
Based on the conversation yesterday, which I was in the education panel, they were talking about a shortage of STEM teachers. And then today, we're talking about having a shortage of doctors and nurses. So it seems like there's a lot of shortage in skilled labor. So I'd be interested to hear how a national policy could incentivize the millennials and others to get involved in those types of programs.
Maybe we need to talk about the working poor, because Medicaid obviously covers those who are eligible in some states, not in this state. And then Medicare covers those who are obviously over a certain age. But there's the working poor, the people who they're not Medicaid eligible, and they don't have enough money to pay for health care. So maybe the working poor we need to focus on a bit more.
100%. One of the largest groups of health care providers in this country are family caregivers. And there needs to be, if we're going to get ahead of the silver tsunami that's going to impact our population across the nation, especially here in Florida, we have to put more resource into home and community-based services, and we have to do something to recognize, empower, and assist caregivers.
One of the things that I would ask the president, if the future president would be, if you can change one thing about our healthcare system, what would that be? Just a simple question, and so they can give an answer, straightforward answer. Because in North Florida, we have a serious problem with healthcare.
The group then put together the following question they would like a presidential candidate to answer.
What would you do to change the Affordable Care Act to include more patient-centered services and eligibles, and to incentivize greater participation by the medical community, caregivers, and millennials in particular?
I'm trying to answer that. Good editor.
No one ever said this question was going to be easy.
That's right.
Along with developing policy questions for the candidates to answer, The Sayfie Review Florida Leaders Summit had suggestions to candidates on how to run their campaigns. Dr. Susan McManus is a political science professor at the University of South Florida and a longtime observer of presidential politics. If you were in a room with presidential candidates and they were, say, 6 weeks out from the Florida primary, what would be some tips that you would give them?
You're best to go to the spontaneous kind of event. Get out of the car, stop in a local restaurant, take your picture with everybody there, because that's going to make bigger news and more positive news on local news channels than is the big fundraiser. So you don't want fundraisers to be the dominant story about why you're coming to an area.
The Sayfie Review Florida Leaders Summit attracted political pollsters who have studied recent Florida voting trends. They had some advice to the candidates on how to reach important segments of Florida voters. Kristen Soltis Anderson is the author of The Selfie Vote, where millennials are leading America. Millennials are a generation of persons born between 1980 and 1999. There are 75 million of them, and they are becoming a significant voting bloc. Ms. Soltis Anderson had some suggestions on how presidential candidates might reach the millennial generation.
When it comes to things like social media and technology, yes, we talk about reaching the next generation and how it's so important to be good about understanding technology and social media to reach them. All of that's absolutely true. But what I think we sometimes forget is that the reason why this stuff is powerful is not because it's technology, it's because it's personal. It's because it's creating personal connections. It's because it's a way to sort of take down the veil, take down the curtain, let people see what's going on behind the scenes. So there's a bit of conventional wisdom out there which says that young voters are socially liberal but fiscally conservative. Have any of you ever heard that before? Well, first of all, it is absolutely the case that young people are much more likely to be independent than either Republican or Democratic these days. The millennial generation is an amazingly pro-family generation. You wouldn't hear it, you wouldn't think that from the news, right? That millennials are all self-absorbed, they're all about themselves. Every piece of data I've seen suggests that millennials are more likely to live in a multi-generational household. They're more likely than young adults were 20 years ago to say that being a good spouse or partner or being a good parent is one of the most important things in life. This is an incredibly pro-family generation. They don't want government defining what family looks like for them, but they believe that family is a hugely important unit of our society that needs to be empowered.
Another pollster, Margie O'Mara, specializes in focus groups. She talked with Orlando residents from both parties and found an awareness of Florida's important role in the presidential election.
And while Floridians don't expect to hear a Florida-specific message, they nonetheless expect to be courted. So make no mistake, everyone is very aware of Florida's role in the election, and they're expecting to be crucial once again, as they always are. So we're the third most populous state. We're a lot of weight. Does my vote count? It counts in Florida. It makes no difference where they get their presidential candidates as long as the ideas are good. So this is, this is part of the sense of, do you need a Florida candidate in order to understand Florida? And these Floridians say, not really, because we're so important. They will come here. We're not at all concerned whether or not they're going to speak to Florida's needs and come here and focus on us, because we're Florida. We're the most, we're going to be in a crucial swing vote, and they're going to have to come here regardless. They don't necessarily need to be from Florida, but we expect them to come here and talk to Florida.
The third annual Sayfie Review Florida Leaders Summit concluded after gathering a broad range of recommendations for presidential candidates to consider. Okay, the March primary, not that far away. Time will come rapidly upon us. Tell us now that this has been completed and there's a lot of information that's been gleaned from this process. Where do we go from here? What's going to be done with it? How will the presidential candidates learn about this information?
Sure.
What will happen?
Well, so what we did at the summit, we had the roundtable discussions, and what the discussion groups did was they asked themselves, what question do we want to ask the presidential candidates? So now we've received dozens of questions that the summit attendees have put together and they've submitted, and now we're going to take the best questions and we're going to put them together into a presidential questionnaire. We're going to submit those questionnaires to every presidential candidate from both of the major parties running for president and give them the opportunity to speak to our audience. We will broadcast, we will email, we will publish the results of any responses we get to from the presidential questionnaires from these campaigns to the Sayfie Review audience. So we're hoping that it gives the presidential candidates an opportunity to address the issues that are important to Florida that the summit attendees put together, and we're going to share that with the larger Sayfie Review audience.
That's all the time for this special edition of Capitol Dateline. We would like to acknowledge and thank Justin Sayfie and his staff and these sponsors of this event for facilitating our coverage of the Sayfie Review Florida Leaders Summit.